He was just walking home one evening, a familiar route under the dim glow of streetlights. 32 years old, college-educated, content in his job at a nearby bookstore. He waved to neighbors, nodded at the joggers, tried to enjoy the fresh air after a long shift. Life was ordinary. Calm, peaceful. Until it wasn single quotes to. Suddenly, blue lights flashed behind him. A patrol car's engine idled a few yards away. A uniformed officer stepped out, voice commanding. "Sir, walk toward the curb." Confusion washed over him. He obeyed, hands open at his sides. Then came questions. "What were you doing here? Where do you live? Are you carrying? Are you on parole?" Parole. He'd never been arrested, let alone convicted, but his answers didn't matter. Not that night. The officer treated him like a suspect, hands on the radio mic, asking dispatch if there was a call, as if he were bait. The man tried to remain calm, respectful, but the officer's tone cut through the quiet street, sharp and suspicious. Then came the accusation. "You're matching the description of someone who tried to snatch a purse downtown." He blinked. That was false. He'd been at work. Thousands of dollars in cash, ring book, scanner, orders. He'd been at the register all evening. He offered to call his manager. Instead, the officer grabbed his shoulder. "You're under arrest." His head spun. In the squad car, cuffs tight. He asked for a phone call. "You'll get it at the station." The officer said. Station time. Cold, concrete room. A metal bench. Harsh overhead light. When he asked again to call someone, the officer smirked. "You'll be here a while." Weeks later, at trial, a single truth hung between them. The officer testified with unwavering confidence. He said the man fit the description, that he resisted verbally, that he appeared agitated, and that all protocol had been followed. The jury listened, but the truth depended on one piece of evidence, a shaky cell phone video, uploaded online by a neighbor. The clip was only 15 seconds long, blurry, but it showed everything. The lack of a description match, the man's calm demeanor, the officer reaching for his taser first, and the man's palms open, never clenched. When the defense played that video in court, the officer froze. For the first time, his eyes darted. He cleared his throat, then uttered words he would regret later. "I must have missed." There it was. Wrongful arrest. Broken trust. A moment of reckoning. The courtroom shifted. You could hear the air change when the defense attorney pressed pause on the video. The room sat in stunned silence, the kind that makes even the floorboards seem to listen. No dramatic music, no sudden gasps. Just quiet realization spreading like a ripple. The judge leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced. One of the jurors tilted her head. Another scribbled something down. Everyone had just witnessed something undeniable, not theory, not testimony, but truth. Raw and unfiltered. Truth that a uniform had tried to bury. The man sat still at the defendant's table, not smug, not bitter, just calm. Because when you've had everything taken from you, your dignity, your record, your peace, you stop reacting. You just watch and wait. His lawyer stood slowly. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the case falling apart under the light of a 15-second video. Later that afternoon, outside the courthouse, reporters huddled on the sidewalk. The man didn't stop for interviews. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. He didn't want to become a symbol or a martyr. He just wanted to go home to his books, his mother's calls, his quiet life. But the story wasn't over. The department launched an internal investigation. The officer was placed on leave. Not for lying, but for administrative discrepancies. That's what they called it. The press release was cold and cautious, carefully worded, like it had been written by someone who feared the truth more than the public did. But the community, they didn't forget. A local journalist wrote a piece, titled "What 15 Seconds of Truth Can Reveal." It went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. The writer described the moment the video played in court, how the jurors' expressions shifted, how justice didn't roar that day, it whispered. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in small, still ways. Sometimes it walks like a man in handcuffs, now free. Months passed. The man tried returning to work, but the bookstore had closed. COVID had hurt business. He applied for other jobs, libraries, front desks, customer service, but the arrest record, though dismissed, still showed up on some background checks. A reminder that being cleared doesn't mean being clean. But he didn't give up. Instead, he began speaking at community centers, quiet gatherings of 10 or 15 people. Not to rage, not to accuse, but to teach. To tell his story, not the way the court told it, the way he lived it. He talked about how fast life can flip, how a simple walk home became a life lesson he never asked for. He talked about the danger of assumptions, the pain of silence, the courage it takes to stay calm when everything in you wants to scream. One night, a teenager approached him after one of those talks, 17, wiry, with 2 large sneakers, and worry in his voice. "What do I do if that ever happens to me?" The man paused, then said softly, "Don't let them define your whole life by one moment. That moment isn't all of you." The boy nodded, but his eyes showed fear. Not of what had happened, but of what could. The man reached into his jacket pocket and handed him a small notebook. "This helped me," he said. "Write it down. Every time something happens to you that doesn't feel right? Don't let the world convince you that your experiences don't matter. They do. You matter." It was a small gesture, but small gestures have a way of echoing when planted in the right hands. That night, the boy started writing, and the man, walking back to his modest apartment with the quiet hum of street lamps overhead, felt the kind of peace he hadn't known in years. Not the kind that comes from revenge, but the kind that blooms after release. He had no job title, no official platform, but he had truth, and he was finally using it. 3 months later, the department dropped the case against him officially and issued a statement acknowledging that miscommunications had occurred. No apology, no admission, just carefully chosen words. But the man didn't care anymore, because people remembered the video, not the press release. The community began holding monthly town halls, small gatherings at first, then more came. Not just victims, but listeners, young people, retired neighbors, even a few officers, off duty, who sat in the back, hats in hand. One of them approached the man afterward. "I saw the footage. I believed it. I'm sorry." The man didn't offer forgiveness, not right away. Some wounds don't heal on demand, but he nodded, and that was enough for now. He began mentoring young men at the local community center, some who had been in trouble, some who were just trying to stay out of it. He didn't lecture, he listened. He shared his story not as a warning, but as an invitation. "You don't have to carry what they put on you," he'd say. "It's heavy, I know, but it's not all yours to carry." One of the boys asked him if he believed in the justice system. He thought for a moment. "I believe in people," he said, "and people sit on juries. People hold phones. People speak up. That's where justice starts, not in a building, but in a choice." Years passed. The story faded from the headlines, but not from the people. His talks grew into workshops. His notebooks filled with letters from young men and women who said things like, "You helped me find my voice," or "I didn't think anyone would believe me until I saw your story." And then one day, he got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a typed message on plain white paper. "I was on the jury. I wanted you to know. I believed you the moment the video played, and I'm sorry you ever had to prove it." He held the letter for a long time. Sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. It comes in private moments, in quiet affirmations, in knowing you kept standing even when they tried to knock you down. He sat by the window one cool morning, steam rising from a chipped mug of coffee, notebook open on the table in front of him. For years, he'd spoken his truth in rooms of 20, 50, sometimes 100 people. But he had never written it all down, not from beginning to end. But now, something in him knew it was time, not for fame, not for revenge, but for the boy who sat on the curb, afraid, for the woman whose brother was still in jail, for the mother who had no video to prove what was done to her son. He began to write not just about the night of the arrest, or the courtroom, but about what it did to his mind, the sleepless nights, the way he stopped answering his phone, the silence from old friends who didn't want to be involved, the way his dignity had been peeled from him in layers, not all at once. And then, the moment he got it back, it wasn't just a book. It was a confession, a letter, a reckoning. 6 months later, the manuscript landed in the hands of a young editor at a small publishing house. She had seen his name before. She had watched the video years ago, in her college dorm room, in disbelief. She never forgot his face. When she saw the proposal, she stayed up all night reading it. She sent a message first thing in the morning. "I think the world still needs to hear this." The book was published quietly, no big tour, no television appearances, but it spread. First in activist circles, then schools. A professor used it in his ethics class. A woman handed it to her son after he was stopped by police walking home. An old man mailed copies to every member of his city council. It became more than his story. It became theirs. One morning, years after the trial, a producer from a national news network called. "We're doing a special," she said, "on cell phone footage and justice. You were one of the first cases where video made the difference. We'd like you to speak." He hesitated. He'd spent so long rebuilding quietly. Public attention hadn't helped before, it had nearly destroyed him, but he thought about the boy on the curb, the one who might be watching, the one who still needed to know they were not alone, so he agreed. On the night the program aired, his inbox flooded. Not just from strangers, but from people who had once doubted him, a neighbor, a distant cousin, even someone who'd once crossed the street to avoid him during the trial. They didn't all say sorry, but some did. One message stood out. It read, "My brother was arrested last year. No cameras, no witnesses, just his word. I showed your story. They dropped the charges." Tears welled in his eyes. Not from grief, not even from relief, but from the weight of knowing that something he endured had helped someone else avoid it. He walked into the community center a few days later, and was met by a standing ovation. Not because he was famous, not because of the show, but because he came back. Every time, because he never stopped showing up. Years passed, the world moved on. As it always does. Headlines faded, news stories took their place. But he stayed rooted in the same community that once feared for him, and later learned from him. He didn't chase platforms. He built them quietly, speaking at schools, sitting with grieving families, volunteering at legal aid clinics, teaching people what to record, when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to fight with dignity. Then one spring afternoon, he got an invitation that surprised even him. It was from the State Bar Association. They were holding a seminar for young public defenders, and they wanted him to give the keynote. He stared at the email for a long time. He remembered the courtroom, the doubt in their eyes, the silence that followed the truth, and now they wanted him to stand at the front of the room and teach the very people who once stood across from him. He said yes. The lecture hall was full, rows of sharp, eager faces. Some were barely older than he'd been the night of his arrest. Some had already fought their own battles in the system. All of them sat in silence as he took the stage. No slides, no microphone tricks, just him, and a story. He told them about the night, not just the facts, but the feelings. The moment he realized the law might not be on his side. The helplessness of being called a liar. The cold hum of fluorescent lights above the holding cell. He told them about the courtroom, about how truth felt heavy in his throat, and how silence felt safer. About the moment the video played on, the jury changed. Then he paused. You will carry people's lives in your briefcases, he said. Some will lie to you. Some will frustrate you. Some will walk into your office already convinced they're guilty because the world told them they were. He scanned the room, but some of them will be me, quiet. I didn't need a savior. I needed someone who believed me before the evidence. Did be that person, please. After his talk, dozens came up to thank him. Some had tears in their eyes. Others shook his hand like they'd just met their mentor. But one young woman stayed behind. She waited until the room was nearly empty. Then she walked up and said, I was 12 when your trial happened. My mom played that video for me. She said, this is why we record everything. Now I'm in law school. He didn't know what to say. She did. Thanks for surviving long enough to teach us. That night, he walked home past the courthouse steps. The same steps where he'd once stood in cuffs, shivering in the wind. He paused and looked up. Same building, same walls. But now, a different man. He sat on the steps for a while, not in protest, not in mourning, but in quiet reflection. He had lost years, lost sleep, lost friends, but he had gained something most never find. He had found his voice, and now, it echoed in lecture halls, in courtrooms. In the stories people told each other late at night when they needed hope. Not every fight ends in victory, but sometimes truth wins loud enough to be remembered, and when it does, justice isn't just served, it's shared. Over time, the scars faded but the lessons did not. He learned that justice wasn't a destination. It was a fight that needed constant tending. Every time someone gave up, every time someone looked away, the balance tipped again, so he kept speaking, kept teaching. But more than that, he kept listening. He listened to teenagers who didn't trust the police, to mothers afraid for their sons, to teachers struggling with biases they didn't know they had. He sat with them, heard them, held their pain without rushing to solve it. That's what the courtroom taught him, that truth takes time and courage. Then, one summer, a national news crew reached out. They were producing a documentary on wrongful arrests and the power of citizen evidence. They wanted him to be the voice that introduced the series. He said yes, but only if they included the people who recorded his moment. The neighbor who stood on her porch, the cashier who hid behind a trash can, the bus driver who refused to delete the footage, even under pressure. I wasn't saved by one video, he told the producers. I was saved by community courage. The producers agreed. And when the documentary aired, it opened with a single line, his voice, quiet and firm. They said I was a threat, but the camera told the truth. The impact was electric. Emails flooded in. From men who had lost faith in the system. From women who had feared speaking up. From teenagers who now believed that truth, when recorded and spoken with care, could change the world. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. But he had become something more powerful, a mirror that made society look at itself. And some people didn't like what they saw. There were threats, doxing, smear articles written by anonymous blogs. They accused him of exploiting trauma, of building a brand on victimhood, but he didn't flinch because he knew. This story was never about him. It was about all the people who never got their videos played in court, all the names turned into hashtags, all the lives reduced to mugshots and biased headlines. So he pressed forward. Years later, his hair had grayed, his voice had deepened, but his fire had only grown. He created a nonprofit, Justice Echo. Its mission: to train youth in documenting injustice safely, to teach storytelling as self-defense, to provide legal counsel for those whose truths were silenced. He traveled from city to city, not for fame, but because he remembered what it felt like to sit alone in a holding cell, wondering if anyone would believe him. Now, he made sure no one had to wonder again. And on the 10th anniversary of his trial, something unexpected happened at the courthouse. The same I invited him to speak on a panel about reform. He hesitated at first, but then he remembered the young woman from the law school, the neighbors who recorded, the jurors who wept when the truth played out in front of them. He accepted when He walked into that courtroom. It didn't feel like a place of trauma anymore. It felt like a temple of memory. He stood at the podium, took a breath, and said, "This place once broke me, but it also showed me something I'll never forget. That truth doesn't need a title. It just needs to be seen." The room rose in applause, and somewhere in the back row, a young man pressed record on his phone, not to go viral but to preserve a moment, because one day, someone else might need to hear it, to feel it, to believe again. After the panel ended, he stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, blinking away the emotions that had quietly crept in during his speech. The courthouse steps were the same ones he had descended a decade ago, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning for shame or support. But now, as he stood tall, a line had formed. People wanted to thank him, not for being a victim but for being a bridge, for turning personal pain into collective power. A young mother approached, clutching the hand of her daughter. She said, "My child wants to be a civil rights lawyer because of your story." A retired police officer shook his hand. "You made me re-examine everything we were taught in training." That's not small. He realized something in that moment. Justice wasn't just about punishment or verdicts, it was about what came after. What society did with the truth once. It was finally heard. The nonprofit grew faster than he expected, not because it had flashy branding or big donors, but because people were hungry to do something, to take action, to be part of a movement that was real, grounded, and accessible. Workshops filled up within hours. Teens arrived with cracked phones and questions like, "What if they tell me to delete it?" Or "How do I protect myself without escalating things?" He gave them tools, legal knowledge, de-escalation techniques, a voice, but more importantly, he gave them hope. Because he knew when people feel powerless, they shut down, but when they feel seen, they rise. One night, after a particularly long day, he sat at his kitchen table reviewing letters from supporters. One stood out. It was from a public defender in a small town, miles away from where it had all started. The letter read, "Your story helped my client, a teenager falsely accused, scared to death. We played your interview in court. It reminded the jury that fear isn't always fact, and silence isn't always guilt. We won." He closed his eyes, let the tears fall, not from sadness but from relief. Relief that the ripple kept moving. Years passed, his face began to appear in history books, in courses on civil rights and modern justice. He didn't seek it. He even found it a bit uncomfortable, but when he visited classrooms, he saw why it mattered. Kids leaned forward. They didn't just listen, they believed. Believed that one person could stand up, speak out, and still survive. He ended every talk the same way. Don't wait for permission to tell the truth. Record it, share it, stand by it. Your story might save someone, even if that someone is yourself. Then came the moment that would test everything. A new case. Different city. Same patterns. A young black man beaten in an alley. Police reports said he resisted. No cameras nearby. No witnesses brave enough to come forward, except one. A janitor, who found a cracked phone near a trash bin. It had recorded everything. Silently, clearly, undeniably. The janitor, afraid of retaliation, called Justice Echo instead of the police. They helped him, protected him, released the footage lawfully, and the public reacted loudly. It was the same cycle he had seen so many times. Outrage, debauch, denial. But this time, something different happened. The city council called an emergency meeting, not just to react, but to rewrite policy. They credited the community. They credited the people who stood up, and they quietly credited him. His team at Justice Echo didn't celebrate with noise. They sat in a circle, breathing, honoring the weight of what had occurred. Justice wasn't a parade. It was a candle passed from one hand to another, fragile yet powerful. Later, when asked if he ever felt exhausted by the fight, he gave the interviewer a small smile and said, "Every day. But then I remember I was once the man who thought no one would believe me. Now, I get to believe in others." And with that, he stood up, walked out of the interview, and headed to another classroom, another city, another voice waiting to rise. Because as long as truth existed, and people had the courage to carry it, he knew the story would never really end. One spring morning, as the cherry blossoms began to bloom outside his modest home, he opened a letter that arrived in a simple white envelope, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a note, handwritten in careful cursive. "I was on the jury. I wanted you to know we believed you. Not just because of the tape, but because of your voice. You didn't yell, you didn't accuse, you simply stood in truth. Thank you for reminding me that justice is more than a verdict, it's a mirror." He'd held the note for a long time. Sometimes, he'd wondered if the jury had truly seen him or if they'd just seen evidence. This quiet letter answered the question in a way no public applause ever could. As his name spread beyond activist circles and legal forums, invitations began to flow in. News programs wanted interviews, publishers wanted memoirs, streaming platforms wanted documentaries, but he paused before accepting any of it, not because he feared attention, but because he feared distortion. Seen what happened when stories were packaged for drama instead of depth, and his story wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't even a victory. It was a process, a lesson. So when he did agree to the documentary, he insisted on one condition, that the focus be on the system, not the moment. Filming began. The director followed him through classrooms, courtrooms, community meetings, and the quiet places in between. There were no reenactments, no background music swells, just truth. One scene captured him speaking with a group of officers and training men and women in uniform, seated with crossed arms and guarded eyes. He began, not with accusation, but with a question. What scares you most about doing this job? The room shifted, voices cracked open. One rookie said, I'm afraid of making a mistake that ruins someone's life. Another whispered, I'm afraid I'll follow orders I don't agree with and won't know how to stop. He listened. Ben shared his story not to shame them, but to show them the cost of unchecked fear. By the end of the session, their arms weren't crossed, their eyes weren't guarded. Something had changed. Maybe not everything, but something. When the documentary aired, it didn't trend overnight. It didn't explode on social media. Instead, it lingered. Teachers showed it in ethics classes. Law students referenced it. In their dissertations, judges quietly passed it to colleagues after tough cases. It was slow justice, but it was justice then. One evening, years after the trial, he received a phone call. The name on the screen, froze him. It was the officer, the one who had lied. He considered ignoring it, letting the past stay buried. But he answered. The voice was trembling. I lost everything, the officer said. And I deserved to. But I need you to know. I watched your speech at the university, and I'm trying to change. He didn't reply with forgiveness. That wasn't his to give. He replied with silence. Sometimes silence speaks louder than judgment. His own son, now in high school, asked him one day, Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? He paused. I wish it hadn't had to happen, he said, but I don't wish it away, because what we do with Panyat's where purpose lives. The boy nodded, quiet, absorbing. And in that moment, he realized that maybe the legacy wasn't in speeches or lawsuits but in small conversations, passed down one heart at a time. On the 10th anniversary of the verdict, they held a vigil. No banners. No microphones, just candles, faces, memory. He looked at the crowd, diverse, resilient, awake, and he spoke the words that had guided him through every twist in his journey. If the system fails you, don't let it define you. Tell your story anyway, because truth doesn't need permission, it just needs courage. Then he blew out his candle, and walked back into the night. Months passed after the vigil, though he returned to a quieter rhythm, working in a nonprofit office by day and mentoring teens in the evenings. His story continued to ripple outward. One afternoon, a teacher from a rural high school called him out of the blue. I showed your courtroom video in my civics class, she said. One of my students hadn't said a word all year, but after that lesson, he stayed behind. He told me your story, gave him the words to talk about something that happened to his brother. He closed his eyes, humbled by the reach of a truth that once nearly broke him. It was always the unexpected moments that carried the deepest weight. On the first warm day of spring, he returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant, not as a plaintiff, just as a visitor. He stood on the same steps where his legs once trembled under the weight of injustice. This time, he didn't tremble. He stood taller. Inside, the halls were the same marble floors, echoing footsteps, tired security guards, but something felt different. Or maybe he was different. He walked past courtroom 3B, the room where it all changed. It was in session, a juvenile hearing. A young boy stood beside his public defender. Head bowed. The boy's mother sat alone in the back, hands clasped so tightly they were white at the knuckles. He didn't know the details. He didn't know the charges, but he knew the fear, and he knew that someone in that room needed to know they weren't invisible. Later that week, he called a few old colleagues and proposed an idea. A court watch program, not to protest, not to interfere, but simply to be present, to watch, to witness, to remind the system that someone was always paying attention. And slowly, it took root. Retired teachers, faith leaders, former defendants, they all took shifts, quietly sitting in the back of local courtrooms. Their presence didn't stop injustice, but it slowed it, dimmed it, nudged it toward light. Sometimes, just knowing someone sees you changes the whole equation. At a small community dinner that summer, a man approached him. He was tall, clean-shaven, eyes nervous. You probably don't remember me, the man said. I was on the force back then. I didn't stop what happened to you. I didn't help. I just kept my head down. There was a long pause. I came to say I'm sorry, and I'd like to join your court watch program. He studied the man's eyes, searching not for guilt, but for honesty. He found it, and he nodded. Then let's start with Wednesday, he said. Years later he published a book, not a memoir, but a guide, Justice in Plain Sight. It wasn't dramatic, no exaggerations, just stories, tools, questions. The first line read, This isn't about me. It's about what we do when no one is watching, and how we act when everyone is. Book clubs picked it up. Colleges added it to reading lists. But the letter came from a father in Mississippi who read it to his daughter one chapter at a time. She was 7. He kept the letter in his wallet. When he was finally invited to speak at a national legal symposium, he almost declined. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a politician. He was just, a man who survived something. But the invitation, Came with a note from one of the event organizers. 10 years ago, I was a clerk at the courthouse where you won your case. Watching you speak changed the way I approach every trial. You reminded me that justice has a face. So he went. And as he stood behind the podium, scanning a room full of robes, titles, and accolades, he took a breath and said, I'm not here to teach you the law, I'm here to remind you of its purpose. After the symposium, people lined up to speak with him, lawyers, law students, judges. Some shook his hand with gratitude. Others stood quietly, tears in their eyes. One young woman hugged him without a word. She was a public defender from Ohio, burned out, overwhelmed, almost ready to quit. But after hearing his story, she said, I remembered why I started. He walked away that evening not feeling proud, but purposeful, because every courtroom he visited, every classroom he spoke in, every word he wrote wasn't about a single case. It was about dignity, the quiet kind, the kind that holds even when the system tries to crush it. Back home, his son now tensed on the floor sorting old photographs. There was one from that long-ago courtroom day, not from inside, but outside, taken by someone in the crowd. He stood holding his son's hand, head bowed, the courthouse behind them. Were you scared here? His son asked, pointing to the photo. He looked at it for a long moment. Yes, he said, but I was more afraid of not standing up for the truth. His son studied his face, then nodded. Quietly, he added, you didn't let them take your voice. That voice grew beyond expectation. He began meeting with young leaders, activists, artists, even law enforcement trainees. He didn't tell them what to think. He told them to look, to listen, to ask better questions. He told them the hardest part of justice isn't the verdict, it's what happens after the verdict. He told them about shame that lingers, and healing that takes work. He told them that not everyone will cheer when you speak up, but some people will wake up because you did. He told them the truth costs, but silence costs more one day. He received a letter from a retired judge, the very judge who once dismissed him, scoffed at his plea, and almost let the whole case vanish in a pile of bureaucracy. It read, you came into my courtroom years ago, and I failed you. I ruled by habit, not by conscience. You didn't just win your case. You woke up my soul. He held the letter in his hands for a long time, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, complex sense of peace. People can change, but someone always has to speak first. As the years unfolded, he continued the work. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was constant. He visited jails where no cameras ever reached. He helped families navigate the legal system when they couldn't afford a lawyer. He showed up for strangers because once someone had done the same for him. He told his story, not for sympathy, but so others could recognize their own strength, because the moment that changed his life wasn't the verdict. It was the decision not to be silent. One evening, a teenager knocked on his door. The boy looked nervous, backpack slung over one shoulder. I go to your old high school, the boy said. They suspended me last week, said I was being aggressive, but all I did was speak up. He invited the boy in. They sat, and he listened. When the boy finished, he said, you did the right thing, but now we need to help them see it. The next day, he walked the boy back into the school. Not to yell, not to fight, but to remind him that young voices matter and deserve respect. He never became rich, never ran for office, never chased headlines, but he left a legacy, not in marble buildings or viral videos, but in the eyes of those who finally felt seen. He taught people that healing isn't passive, it's active, that justice isn't just a destination, it's a discipline, that being brave doesn't mean being unafraid, it means stepping forward anyway, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear in the quiet spaces between courtroom visits and community meetings. He began journaling again. Late at night, after his son was asleep, he'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and write not about justice, not about the system, but about dignity, fear, and the choices we make when no one is watching. He wrote about how anger, if not transformed, becomes bitterness, how pain, if shared wisely, becomes power, and how truth, even whispered, can move mountains if someone is listening. Eventually, those journals turned into a book. He didn't write it to be famous, he wrote it so that the next time someone was wrongly accused, wrongly silenced, or wrongly erased, they'd know they weren't alone. The book was called Voice Under Pressure. It sold modestly, but it reached deeply. A high school English teacher in Detroit built a whole semester around it. A legal aid group in Atlanta used it in their orientation. A prison literacy program in Texas made it required reading for release. He began receiving letters, hundreds of them. Some were long, others were just a few words. You made me feel human again. Your story is my story. Thank you for surviving so I could believe. One letter stood out. It was from a man currently serving time in a federal facility. The handwriting was messy, the paper torn, but the words, I spent most of my life thinking the system owned me. Then I read your story. I realized I still had my mind. I still had my truth. I'm writing my daughter for the first time today, because if you could find your voice, maybe I can find mine. He held that letter against his chest for a long time, and he wept, not because of sorrow, but because the ripple had begun. In time, his name faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories, louder dramas, but he was okay with that. He never wanted fame. He wanted change, and change, he learned, is quiet. It moves slowly, patiently, like water cutting through stone. He taught his son this: don't chase loud victories. Chase rightness, chase peace, chase meaning. And most of all, don't ever let the world convince you that your truth isn't enough. One afternoon, a documentary crew came to interview him. They set up lights in his living room. They asked the usual questions. What was it like to face false charges? What gave you the strength to keep going? What would you say to others in your position? He answered gently, without drama. But before they left, the youngest crew member, barely 23, asked, something off script, do you regret speaking up? Would your life have been easier if you had stayed quiet? He smiled, not the polite smile, the real one, the kind that's earned after years of scars and healing. Maybe easier, but not mine, he said. My life would have belonged to their fear, not my truth. The crew packed up, but that final quote became the trailer headline, and weeks later, it went viral. Maybe easier, but not mine. It was printed on posters, used in social justice campaigns, tattooed on arms and rib cages, scribbled into notebooks, by high school kids learning how to stand for something. He didn't post about it, didn't brag, he just smiled again and kept moving forward, because somewhere, someone was being silenced, and they needed to know that the silence could be broken. Somewhere, a voice was cracking from pressure, and it needed to know that cracks let the light through. Somewhere, a child was watching, a parent endure injustice, and they needed to see resilience, not revenge. That's what his story had become, not a courtroom victory, not a book deal, not a viral moment, but a legacy of courage. Years passed, but the lesson never dulled. He watched his son grow, not into a copy of him, but into something stronger, someone who didn't just speak truth when it was convenient, but especially when it was dangerous. His son became a youth counselor at a local nonprofit, working with kids who came from broken systems and bruised trust. Some had been expelled without cause, others had parents locked away for crimes they didn't commit, but all of them, every single one, needed someone who understood. He never told them the full story, just pieces, just enough to let them know he had walked through fire and come out with skin, heart, and hope still intact. One boy asked him once, "Why do you care if nobody listens?" He knelt beside the boy, quiet, gentle, "Because I remember how it felt when no one listened, and I promised I'd never become like them." That night, the boy wrote his own speech, the first time he'd ever spoken in public. 2 months later, he was on stage at a community event, reading his truth aloud, hands shaking, voice cracking, but when he finished, the entire room stood, not just because of what he said, but because he had dared to say it. The man was in the back of the room. He didn't clap, he didn't cry, he just stood tall, proud, silent, the way trees do when they've weathered 1,000 storms. One morning, years down the line, he got a call. It was a newly appointed public defender in a nearby state. She had read his book in college, and now she was helping overturn wrongful convictions. She wanted to thank him because his story had pushed her through the darkest days of law school, the moments when everyone told her the system wouldn't change. "I don't know if it has changed," she said, "but I have, and I think that matters more than people realize." He smiled through the phone. "Yes," he said softly, "that's how it begins." One of the last public talks he ever gave was in a modest auditorium at a community college. No cameras, no press, just 200 students and a single spotlight. He stepped on stage, paused, and said, "Everything they tried to take from me, I took back the slow way, with grace, with patience, with truth. Not because it was easy, but because it was mine." He paused. "You won't always be heard the first time you speak, or the second, but speak anyway, because silence is not safety, it's surrender." After the applause died down, a young woman approached him. She wore a simple blazer, but her eyes were heavy with memory. "My father was wrongfully imprisoned when I was a child. I used to think telling the truth didn't matter, but now," she choked up, "now I'm going to law school, because I want the truth to matter again." He took her hand. "It always mattered," he said. "We just needed more voices to protect it." That night, he sat alone in his study. A candle flickered on his desk. Outside, the world buzzed with noise and distraction, but inside it was still. He picked up his pen and wrote one final note in the back of his journal. "I did not win everything I wanted, but I won back my name, my dignity, my voice. And in doing so I gave others permission to find theirs." He closed the journal, set down his pen, and looked out the window into the night. There were still battles to fight, still voices to lift. But tonight, he rested, not in victory, but in peace. Months passed. The headlines moved on, as they always do. A new case, a new name, another cycle of outrage and silence. But for him, life had not returned to normal because there was no normal to return to. Every room he entered, every eye that looked at him, held something different now. Not pity, not admiration. Something quieter, something like respect. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't chased it. But when you stand up, and keep standing long, after they expect you to fall eventually, people notice. He became a guest speaker at community meetings, at schools, at legal panels. His voice, once ignored, now carried weight. Not because he was louder but because people knew he had lived what others only studied. Still, the scars remained. He had nightmares sometimes. Flashbacks of the courtroom, of the officer's voice on the stand. Calm, confident, convincing, and yet, false. What saved him wasn't a loud protest or a well-placed connection. It was truth. Small, raw, digital truth, recorded by a stranger's phone and uploaded before it could be buried. That truth didn't just clear his name, it became a seed. Years later, a young man approached him at a book signing. "I don't know if you remember me," he said, his voice nervous. "But I was there that night. I'm the one who recorded the video." He looked up. For a second, the noise around them fell away. "You saved my life," the man said, "and you didn't even know it." They hugged. No words could cover what passed between them, just truth, just silence, just healing. One of his final interviews was with a journalism student who asked, "If you could go back, if you could erase everything, would you?" He thought for a long moment. "No," he said, "because everything that broke me also built me. I lost time. I too lost trust, but I found something stronger than either, conviction, and I found out that even when systems fail, people can still show up." He didn't become rich. He didn't become famous. But when his daughter graduated law school, she handed him a note instead of a speech. It read, "Dad, you didn't just raise me. You raised the bar for truth, for courage, and for justice. Because of you, I will never be silent when it matters." He cried quietly in the back row, not because of the pain, but because it was worth it. The day she passed the bar exam, his daughter brought home more than just a certificate. She brought home a mission, and she wasn't the only one. His story, once buried under fear and bureaucracy, had become a ripple. Law students cited his case in research papers. Civil rights attorneys referenced it during training. Even officers in reform programs were shown the courtroom video, not as a gotcha, but as a lesson. Truth, when captured and shared, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it echoes slowly, steadily, until it becomes a chorus. He had lived through one of the worst betrayals a system could offer, being accused, arrested, and almost destroyed by those sworn to protect. But now, walking through the same courthouse where he had once sat shackled in silence, he walked freely, purposefully, with his head high, not as a victim, as a witness. A young officer approached him one day after a public panel. "Sir," the officer said, hat in hand, "your case changed how I see this badge. We don't all deserve respect, we earn it. You made that clear." He didn't respond with anger, just a nod. Sometimes progress doesn't shout. It shows up. That the years rolled on. New cases, new struggles, new names etched into the long history of pain and perseverance. But one thing had shifted. People were watching now, recording, refusing to look away. He wasn't bitter, he was grateful. Grateful that what nearly broke him helped build something bigger. Because justice, real justice, doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces, in verdicts, in voices, and in the quiet strength of those who refuse to stay silent, no matter the cost.